This is Sarah Duncan interviewing Robert Farmer for the Sandy Creek Park Oral History Project of the Russell Library. This is August 2nd, 2005, and we're at the Sandy Creek Park Visitor Center in Athens, Georgia. Okay, so why don't we go ahead and begin? Why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself?
Well, I'm self-employed at the present time in design and construction. I graduated from Commerce High School in Jackson County and attended the University of Georgia School of Environmental Design and Landscape Architect Division, and have been self-employed since the 1970s, and most of the time as a landscape architect and general contractor. I married, have 4 children. 2 of my sons work with our company now, and 2 daughters, and I have 7 grandchildren. So, I'm 62 years old and presently plan to retire at 65.
You said you went to UGA?
Yes, I did.
School of Environmental Design. About when did you?
In the 60s, I think 61 through 64 or 5, Dean Owens was dean who actually helped found and establish the school. And at the time I attended the University of Georgia, I think there were approximately 3,700 to 4,500 students, 7,000 when I graduated, and we, I think, had about 100 students in the landscape school.
Wow.
So, go way back, I guess.
Yeah. Sounds like that was a pretty intimate program then.
It was, had a lot of personal attention. One of my professors, Bill Berry, actually retired from the university and lives in Athens, and we have done some work for his firm that he designed. So, go way back.
What kind of work did you start out doing in your early career?
When I finished the University of Georgia, I started to work for a firm in Columbia, South Carolina, Ken Simmons and Associates. Mr. Simmons was a landscape architect and civil engineer. He had started his career under the Roosevelt term with the Park Service, and was from Columbia, South Carolina area, and wanted to go back there. So he established his firm, and I worked with him for approximately 2.5-3 years. And then I came back to Athens, was employed with Ben McElroy and Associates for about 4 years. Left there and went with a large development corporation and worked about 3 to 4 years, I guess, there. And then I established my own firm and have been in Athens ever since. So from, let's say, 1971, 67, 71, 74, been self-employed.
Okay, so it was 1974 that you established your firm. You said that first firm you worked for was Ken Simmons and Associates,
Yes.
and he had worked for the National Park Service?
Correct.
So what kind of projects did you do, park projects?
We did, let's see if I can remember, we did a lot of subdivision design. At that time in Columbia, they were just beginning to use landscape architects and to design projects. Previous to that, land surveyors had just laid out the subdivisions. So we were kind of beginning to work into that area and establish that. Mr. Simmons had a lot of government contracts. I worked on the Charleston Naval School site. I always tell the story about that. I was drafted in the Army, and they notified me that I wouldn't be called in, that my classification was being changed, and I couldn't understand why, and so I contacted my local draft board, and told them what had happened. I said, "Is this a mistake?" And they said, "No, you've been reclassified. You're working on top secret project." So I went back to my boss and I said, "What in the world's going on?" And he said, "What's happening?" I explained to him. He said, "Oh, well, you've been locating trash cans at the naval base at Charleston, South Carolina. So our top secret project was location of trash dumpsters and cans." But found out later that, just as it relates to the terrorism now, that that was a favorite thing to do, is drop a bomb or leave a bomb in a trash can or dumpster. So someone had to locate those, and they had to be relocated periodically, and they had to be mapped and documented. So
Wow.
thought it was kind of an interesting project. We did a lot of college campuses. We did 3 that I worked on: Winthrop College, Southern Baptist College, and then an all-girls college there in Columbia, South Carolina.
Okay.
I believe it was Columbia College.
Okay.
So principally either campus work or subdivision design or the naval work, which I had no clue what was going on. Just
That's funny.
did what they told me to do.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Wouldn't have occurred to me that location of trash cans was
I didn't think it was
such
I didn't think it was a very important job at the time, I'll be honest with you. Then with Ben Mackerel and Associates, we did a lot of university survey and engineering work for the university, and then a lot of subdivision design in Clark County, Cedar Creek subdivision, most of the older developments. And then I guess when I became self-employed, I continued along the same lines, same type of work.
Had you done any parks before getting into this?
Well, the college campus was my,
Yeah.
I guess, largest experience, and we had, we did the park in Oconee County, Michael Park, and we did hurricane shows in Jackson County previous to this, and had worked Barrow County, I believe. We had done their park prior to this, to Sandy Creek Park.
What do you remember about this project?
A lot of fond memories of the people that we worked with, and the site itself, having, as I expressed to you earlier, that we had I had worked for Ben Mackerel and Associates, who did prepare the original boundary survey and design documents, and we, of course, I was very familiar with the site, having worked on that. And then I remember that this was one of the largest park designs in the area, and I think was very fortunate that our firm was selected. Originally, the Soil Conservation Service had selected a firm to do some preliminary design work. Excuse me. And there was some disagreement between the county and the park and the Soil Conservation Service as to why they would not let local designers, which there were 2 or 3 firms capable of doing this type of design, do the work. And so Clark County interviewed the firms on their own, and we were selected by Clark County, and then Soil Conservation Service reviewed us, or our firm, and allowed us to do the design work at the request of Clark County. Mm-hmm. At the time, there were a number of commissioners who felt like that local people should be utilized as much as possible for this project, because there was a lot of local tax dollars going into the project. And the feeling of the commissioners was that local firms could do just as good a job as out of state or out of town firms. We had good working relationship with the Soil Conservation Service, and they were principally in charge of reviewing all documents. Clark County was our principal employer, but the SCS was the design supervisor, so to speak, and review of all documents. Some of the most rewarding parts of the project to me was actually seeing our design implemented, and then as the park opened and experiencing or seeing the use of the park. My family and small children utilized the park quite a bit, and it was, I thought, well received by the community, and as far as I know, has been well used and enjoyed by the community. Design, I think, was good. I think there's always improvement and changes that you could make, but the goal for the project, as I envisioned it, was to have a natural site that the parents and children could feel comfortable in and enjoy nature and the natural environment.
Maybe you could expand on that a little bit. What did you see as the original priorities for this park?
Well, Clark County had a need for organized recreation, as well as at that time Sandy Creek Nature Center was just a baby and being envisioned, so to speak. There were no nature trails, so there was an ideal site for the trails, and we did construct trails around the entire lake. There was at one time planned to have a bridge across the lake, but we were not able to ever see that accomplished, which was a disappointment. But the trails were completed. The amphitheater, the programs that would bring the children in the city back to the community and the country. Our envision was to have both a naturalistic area and a formal area, and that's why a soccer field was one of the first in Clark County, or in the area, was designed for this site. I don't think it was utilized as much as it could have been because of later direction that the park took. But and then the ball fields, tennis courts were utilized quite a bit. The community building for outdoor or open air activities. Of course, the swim beach was a major attraction. One of the disappointments, at one time there was a dock in the lake that you could, a swim dock you could swim out to and back, and I think that was eventually taken down, removed. I particularly like the restriction of no motorized boats. The electric motors would, I know my sons and I would take a flat bottom boat, and the electric motor was adequate to carry us through the entire lake for a day. So that was, I felt like a good accomplishment that we were able to work out. And you could actually row the lake in a canoe or whatever. The lake was approximately 250 acres, which made it a very nice size for fishing or relaxing in a canoe or small boat. I felt like the setting for the park was fantastic. It was beautiful terrain. We had a lot of versatility. We had hills, slopes, flat fields. open areas already established with some tremendously beautiful hardwoods, and the vegetation was lush and beautiful. That's about all I can think of at the present time.
When you said that you're kind of describing the setting, maybe you could just describe the first time that you saw this area and what you saw if you were, say, standing kind of at the gatehouse looking out at the park.
The first vision of the site was the open pasture land. And then as you explored the site, you realized that there were some very unique areas with large hardwoods and large trees. There was some history of how this site had been utilized in the past. It was thought to have been used by the Cherokee Indians on the creek bed area. At the time that I first reviewed the site for design purposes, the lake was under construction, and most of the area around the streams had been cleared for the lake area. When I had worked for the firm that did the boundary survey, I had been able to see some of those sites previous, but my first impression was the pasture and the hardwoods that were available, and many times you do not have that in a park setting.
Yeah. You talk about the hardwoods, would those be roughly in those same areas where they are today?
Yes, many of them are still existing. We try not to disturb any more than we had to put in the necessary roads, streets, and parking facilities for instance, the amphitheater, the picnic area, the barbecue buildings, and those type facilities.
Yeah.
We did do some interview with local citizens as to what their desires would be for the park, and that's the reason that the barbecue building and the amphitheater and the large community building were constructed. Those were needs that were the commissioners and citizens felt could be utilized the most. Soccer field was one of the particular areas that was requested.
When you say that you did interviews with local citizens, how did that work exactly? Was it like a full study, or?
It was not as formal a study as I have seen prepared, but what we did do was meet with local citizen groups. I remember the county commissioners had a group in that were just some of the citizens that were familiar with the site in the area. Some of the I discussed with some of the committee members for the Soil Conservation Service, which are local citizens and property owners. I believe one of them was an adjoining property owner of this site. We discussed with at that time the recreation director for the county was just a minimal operation, so we did discuss with them, but not very formal organization at that time. There was, I'm trying to remember back, there were many things that we did on the project that I probably don't remember. I believe we met with the school of the landscape architect school and discussed with them at one point what they thought their needs might be, or the needs of the community. We did meet with two of the local engineering firms who were familiar with subdivision design and what their needs might be. We met with two legal firms, and I'm trying to remember why, but I do know that one of them had interest in the soccer field and the ball fields, and the chairman of the county commissioners, Jim Holland, was very interested in the athletic end of the division. He had worked with, the design. He had worked with the youth in the community quite extensively, and Jim wanted to see the ball fields and the soccer field. The county attorney had a very strong interest, Ray Nicholson, in the soccer field. So,
you said you had a very strong interest, like wanted to see him.
Yes, he knew a lot of kids that wanted to play soccer but had no place to practice at that time. And most of the preliminary design work was previously established when we actually took over the project, but we added and took away from the project as our studies indicated the needs.
I see.
The barbecue building, for instance, was requested by some of the local organizations as a place to utilize for their meetings and gatherings. There was a large request or need from citizens for the campground and the RV campground, but it was determined by the commissioners and the SCS to design and build the campgrounds, but not to put in the RV park. And I don't think the RV park has ever been established. But that was one item that citizens requested that we did not, were not able to have put into the project. As far as I know, we were able to accomplish most of the desires of the community with the project.
When you talk about kind of local citizens, were these mostly people from Athens itself, or from kind of out in the county, or kind of some of each?
I would say some of each, but principally from Athens, Clark County. Our firm worked with a lot of the subdivisions and a lot of the community organizations at that time, so we had some input as to what they would desire to begin with. Excuse me. We knew that the subdivisions that were being developed in the area at that time did not have any recreation facilities and did not have very much open space. So there was a definite need for this type facility in the county. I think it was just one of the greatest assets that Clark County has been able to obtain. It's 250-acre lake and approximately 800 acres, I believe, or is it?
It's somewhere between 700 and 800.
700 to 800 acres of land area, so which does include the 250-acre lake.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
But that was just a tremendous asset to the county, as I envisioned it. I'm not sure that that it has been utilized over the years with the potential that it does have. But it's certainly a beautiful site.
Yeah.
It has been maintained well. Very pleased to see that the trees have been established. The buildings are still in good condition over the years. This project is approximately 25 years old now.
Yeah,
25.
about next year. You mentioned maintenance. Did you know what the maintenance staff would be when you were working on your design?
Yes, we were told that there would be a maintenance facility on site. The project would be maintained principally by the county and either prison labor or a staff. And at that time, I'm trying to remember, I think there would be 2 full-time staff members with utilizing prison labor, if I'm allowed to say that, as assistance to these.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know what the present staff consists of at this time. Now I'm calling maintenance staff. The security was done by Clark County or the Sheriff's Department at the time, and the entrance gate that would have been another personnel
Oh, I see.
type person. Also, the local game warden was utilized in assistance for patrolling the lake and patrolling the property. There were deer, fox, squirrel, number of possum, raccoon, number of animals that were on site, and the local game warden was very cooperative and helpful in assisting the county in maintaining the park and establishing the fish population in the lake. So there was actually, after we finished, three or four major government agencies involved in the park.
Yeah.
And I think they all work together well. It's kind of unusual, but they did back then.
Yeah, that's kind of something I was going to ask you is how was it working with so many agencies from your perspective?
Okay. Well, initially, to be very frank, the Soil Conservation Service was not very happy that their firm did not do the design. So it was a little bit difficult, but my approach and my attitude was that we have a job to do and that we want to work with everyone involved the best we can. I found that the personnel with the Soil Conservation Service immediately responded, and we worked well together. We were actually given a letter from Texas, which I was very proud of, from the very high up in the service, that we had prepared documents and plans that were of high quality, and we really appreciated that. So the most difficult part was initially working with the SCS, but as time progressed, it became a very good working relationship for us. We did not pursue any other government projects of this type because our firm just was very involved in other projects, and we eventually evolved into a construction or more design and build type firm. So, but I enjoyed working with both government agencies. Clark County, of course, was a very small government agency at that time, and it was very easy to work with their personnel. I guess at the end of the project, George Chandler and Nancy Blunt Smith were the two principal personnel that we worked with.
Now, you mentioned that the Soil Conservation Service reviewed the plans. Was that right? I was just wondering how that process worked.
The SCS reviewed all documents that we prepared for the county and either approved, signed off, or we made revisions for them.
I see.
But they had the final review of all documents. It was principally their funds that was doing the work, but the county had to share 50-50 in the design plans. So that's the reason the county felt like they had input into that area so strongly. But I don't remember the exact proportion of funding for the facility itself. I could look that up, but I just don't remember what the percentage ratio. But I would say that the federal government put in about 80% and the county 20% or something of that nature.
And you did say that there had been a design firm that had come through and done a preliminary design. What had already been done by the time you came in?
The only thing that they prepared was a master plan of the site, and that was what would be considered very preliminary document.
Yeah.
I do not know how much research they put into that. I think most of it came from the Soil Conservation Service personnel, but it was just a one sheet document type thing.
Yeah, so it's very, very preliminary.
Yes, right. It was our responsibility, and our contract was to actually design the park and prepare all of the working documents and to have those ready for bids. I believe, if I remember correctly, most of the contracts were let by the federal employees. Once we prepared the documents, they would put them out for bids. The county did a lot of work on the site as in-kind or their contribution to the project. That's where George Chandler and his crews, I think George was a county engineer at the time, and they did a tremendous amount of physical work on site. If I remember correctly, most of the buildings were built by contractors that bid the project. Most of the streets and grading was prepared by outside contractors, but the county did the trails. They did a lot of the general cleanup in the undergrowth, and later became a lot more involved in physical construction, but that kind of evolved over the end of the project.
Was it, I guess I'm trying to think, I mean, what was it like coming into this and having kind of this lake there and some preliminary plan and then working around that?
In some areas it was very difficult. You wanted to put in your own design ideas, but it was a situation to where you weren't allowed certain freedom. The Soil Conservation Service had, for instance, they had not ever allowed an RV park design, so they felt that would not be comparable to what their goals were for an area. And they, quite frankly, had to be very careful about the type facilities they allowed in order to meet their guidelines for funding. So that was a little difficult. We had quite a bit of flexibility in revising or changing the master plan. However, there was some areas of the master plan that we felt were good and wanted to continue with. The most difficulty was meeting the limitations that the government had to work with as far as design. I'm trying to think of an example, but at present time, I guess the RV park was the largest one that we could not work with up front. The second area was, for instance, the community building had restrictions. By making it an open-air building, we were able to meet their design requirements, and they could still fund the project. The amphitheater and the park and, the picnic areas was okay for them. They were free to work in those areas with their funding. I don't remember any major issues that we were involved in as far as having to just scrap totally an area for design. But I do know that there were certain size restrictions on, for instance, the barbecue building and those type of things that just had to meet their regulations. As far as any technical construction, they were probably more stiffer than say the county regs would have been, or as far as paving and street construction, grassing specifications, landscaping specifications were
Yeah. I see.
very detailed from the federal level. I would say the construction cost was normally a little higher than it would have been if you were able to contract with local contractors, but there again, with the federal government paying the principal portion of the bill, they had to go under their guidelines.
I see.
And but overall, we didn't find anything that was just impossible. And I guess, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Can you erase, or do you just?
No, I just paused.
Oh.
We're okay.
I lost my train of thought.
No, let's see. You just said that construction costs were a little higher because they had to, I guess, bring in contractors.
Well, their requirements, such as the bonding requirements and experience requirements, were greater than. There were many local contractors that could have produced the job well, but were not qualified under the federal regulations.
I see. Yeah, a little musical accompaniment. You mentioned earlier that the game warden was involved. Now, how important was wildlife management to the project?
Wildlife management was very important to all parties involved, and I think with that agency working with the county, particularly as the county maintained the project in the future, I think it was very beneficial. Nancy didn't go into that very much.
She did a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
but I thought I was kind of thinking from your perspective while you were actually designing the park, if that kind of was something that was in your head somewhere.
I don't remember us having specific consultation with the forest or the game warden department, but I do know that on some occasions we had worked with the game warden, and when he was brought in to manage and assist, and it was very beneficial to the project, I thought.
Yeah. Do you remember if it was originally planned to be a wildlife sanctuary from the start?
Yes, I think the intent of the design was for the project to be a rural project. It was to be as naturalistic as possible, but there were certain design requirements that required some of the areas to be disturbed. I do know that all the ball fields, fortunately, these were open pastures and open fields, and we were able to put or work with a design that allowed us to maintain as much of the naturalistic areas as we could. The deer population was good. I don't know how it is now, but for quite a few years
there
it
are a lot of them.
it was probably too many of them. Fishing was good initially because the pond was managed the first year or two. I don't know how much of the other wildlife is still here. The birds, there was groups that even under construction that did erect some birdhouses and some feeders. So, and of course, being so close to the University of Georgia, with so many different departments involved, the park has been utilized, I think, by. And then the nature trail being connected, which I was fortunate to be working with a lot of the property owners in developing the subdivisions, and feel like I assisted by us donating some of the wetlands and the properties, or negotiating with the county and the developer to have that accomplished. So the Cook Trail, for instance, was one of those areas that we were able to, I think there was 4 major property owners that we were able to work with and have them donate properties to the county. In return, they received some tax credits. So I think it was good for both parties involved.
You mentioned donors for the land that became Cook's Trail. Now, how was this land originally acquired for the park itself?
It was acquired by the federal and county government.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I don't remember the percentage or ratio. This was a lot of, at the time this was developed, the Soil Conservation Service, the federal level, had a regional office in Athens, in
Mm-hmm.
the federal building. So a lot of the personnel there were local citizens.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then the county commissioners were very aggressive, and I believe Representative Stevens, or this representative before him on the federal level, was very involved in obtaining this site and approval for this project. So we go back to a lot of good foresight. Our county commissioners, our state and local representatives, and the Soil Conservation Service. I guess one of the disappointing things for me was that, being a Jackson County citizen and living very close to the north end of the park, we were never able to get Jackson County involved in the project, which today would be a tremendous benefit had to Jackson County had they become involved. But the commissioners at that time were just not as able to visualize the potential as well as the Clark County commissioners. And I think it's interesting. We never, most projects you establish a bronze plaque that lists the commissioners and lists the designers and everyone involved. And the commissioners were not out for that glory. They just said, "We're fine. Don't put our names on it. Build the park. We will know that we established it." But Commissioner Jim Holland, Gene Sapp, Miss, I can't think of the lady's name. She was from the Cedar Creek area. And Mr. Hugh Logan, and there was one other gentleman that were county commissioners, and they were all very interested in this being a community facility. So I will later on think of the other 2 gentlemen commissioners, but they deserve a lot of credit for the foresight that they had. But I always thought it was interesting they did not need or desire the credit that many commissioners desire.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
You mentioned the RV park. Now, was that a part of the plan originally?
No, it was not allowed to be because of the funding.
I see.
It was a desire of the community, but it was not allowed by the federal government.
Huh.
At one point, down the road, the county did obtain permission to do design work for that, but it was never funded by the federal or local government agencies.
That's why I was getting confused, because I knew in the mid or late 80s that proposal came up again, but
Correct.
But that was actually the second time it was actually a thought at the very beginning of the
Exactly.
project.
It was initially a desire of the community, I should say, but it was not as actually under the federal guidelines. It was not allowed at that point in time. The federal parks were mostly for campsites and picnic tables and picnic areas. And that was designed and put into the project.
Yeah, yeah. Huh.
The squirrel's nest I thought was a unique feature. We had a lot of fun designing that and working with that. It's basically a shed that has multi-levels and covered. And in the past, I know the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts and the local boys clubs and girl clubs groups utilize that, and then some local citizens, would have a group that would stay there. And then we had a lot of small covered campsites and then open naturalistic campsites. None of these sites were allowed to be entered by vehicle. You parked in the parking lot and walked to those sites. And then the trails that were connected to, those sites were connected to the trails that were throughout the park.
I see. You mentioned just there that the sites were not allowed to be entered by vehicle. Was that another regulation, or was it?
That was one of the design concepts.
Okay.
That vehicles would be allowed into the park, but they would be parked and you utilize the trails. And it makes it a little inconvenient for our modern day life, but I think it's very, very nice that we've been able to accomplish that.
Mm-hmm.
We all want to park in our front door, but the exercise doesn't hurt.
Yeah, I suppose that's true. Now, you kind of mentioned that there's the lake and there's kind of the soil conservation service regulations and so on. Those are some kind of challenges that I suppose you came across. What about the natural area itself, the landscape itself? Did it offer any particular challenges that were difficult or advantages?
I don't think it had offered any difficult challenges. I think it was exciting to be able to work with the vegetation and the terrain and the topography. I should mention at some point that one of the reasons for the lake was that there was a tremendous amount of flooding in Clark County and particularly in the city area. And one of the justifications for this lake was to control that flooding process. And I think it has accomplished a lot of that. But by it being managed in the manner that it has, we have some wetlands that have been reestablished. We have the water facilities that give us the utilization of pleasure and relaxation and recreation. But we've not destroyed the entire property by putting it all underwater. So going back to design, the vegetation, the terrain was a tremendous asset, I think, for the site.
Yeah. And how did you work with the terrain? You mentioned that now you did put the ball fields in this sort of meadow area. Was that a conscious decision that you kind of made because that meadow was going to be?
Yes. Now there was fortunately a large enough cleared area.
I think we should pause for a minute, actually. All right.
Now I felt we were very fortunate in that we had a large open area and that we could meet some of the desires and requirements of the project by utilizing those open areas for the ball fields. Fortunately, the terrain did not require a tremendous amount of grading. The topography was good. And we were also able to leave, for instance, the area around this facility in the natural pasture, open area. This, I feel like, provides vegetation and feed for the wildlife, particularly deer, and I'm sure they're still here and as populated as they were. So we were very fortunate in that area that we could leave some of the area natural in the open pasture. Fortunately, the cemetery was not a design problem. There is an existing cemetery on the site. Many times, the location of those can create problems, but this particular location of the existing cemetery did not create any problems. Some of the older citizens said there was some ghosts that rambled around on the project, but we did not become involved or did not see any, so that was very fortunate for us, I guess.
I suppose that depends on the ghost, right?
Yes, I guess so. The ghost didn't like us or something. So.
I've heard, you mentioned that it's been thought that this might have been a Cherokee site at one point. I heard that there was a Cherokee site or possibly a Creek site over by that camp area. Do you remember anything about that?
We could, in our work, we did not find any visual signs, no pottery, no arrowheads or anything that confirmed this. It's my understanding that when there was some grading going on in the lake site, there might have been some pottery, but that could have washed down from other sites. But I think that was the history, that at one point this was a general area used by the Cherokee Indian Nation. We did not, on any of the site, come across any graves or pottery, arrowheads, anything of that nature.
Any kind of archaeological?
No, not that I could see. The cemetery was the only archaeological. Yeah. Of course, that, as we've mentioned earlier, discussed, had a lot of very old graves, and some very well marked, some not so well. Maybe just a rock as a headstone or something. I was fascinated with the gates and the ironwork around the cemetery. At one time it had been well maintained.
What kind of condition did the Soil Conservation Service leave the land in after building the dam? Were there any sort of challenges associated with that?
I'm not as familiar with anything that they might have experienced. I do know that there was quite a bit of research involved in the dam spillway because of the fact that this was a flood-controlled dam, and they did not want to restrict the normal flow of the creek, which was fairly large. So, of course, and I haven't been back to see what kind of erosion problems, but the 4 or 5 years that we worked with the project, it was a good design. It worked well. So we didn't see or experience any major erosion problems. You have the natural erosion of the bank with a lake, water movement from wind does erode. And my understanding, and we did experience at the end some silting of the upper end of the lake, which actually created a very nice wetlands or natural area. It was difficult to do any boating in that area, but as large as the lake was, it didn't seem to create a problem. The development, fortunately, to my knowledge, was restricted around the lake, so there's been no major disturbances. There's some subdivisions that have been put in around the lake, but most of those have large lots and have not created an environmental problem to the park that I am aware of.
Yeah.
We didn't experience any during the design period. There were some pastures with, of course, cows and horses, and some of the streams would have, visual signs of that, but not on the capacity, according to the water quality people, that we had any concerns with and would anticipate. Okay.
What about like the area where they kind of took land to make the dam, which I assume must have come from kind of that ball fields area? Was that?
No, I think principally that borrow pit was taken from where the beach area is.
Okay.
I think there was a good considerable amount of soil taken there. Actually, this is not a very long dam, or not a very large dam for the amount of water that it backs up. It was a good site for the dam, and there was some bar area on the east side of the dam, but I don't remember there being very much of a bar area. There is a small area on the west side of the dam, now that I recollect.
Okay.
Of course, the Soil Conservation Service regrassed and did an excellent job of
So
preserving that area. Yes, it was immediately regrassed. And our major erosion problems came from just the existing gullies and ditches that probably originated when this was probably cotton or farmland. There was some, I'd say 10 or 12 deep gullies and ditches in the wooded area. And we had one area I remember we had to be a little bit cautious and careful with. We tried to just leave it in its natural state, but did have to do some work for erosion control in that area. The farmland had been well maintained as pasture, and so it was not in what I would call poor conditions. Most of the areas we grassed, we did not have to re-top soil. We just were able to establish grass and maintain normal maintenance.
And those gullies, you said they were in the wooded areas?
Yes.
Okay.
On the northwest side of the property, I remember in particular.
You mentioned the swim beach, and that's certainly one of the most popular parts of the park now. Was that kind of how did the idea for that come up?
I don't remember the exact idea. I do remember at that time there were a lot of swimming pools in the area. Most of the subdivisions would have a community pool, and there was a desire by some of the citizens that a more natural area be provided. However, when we decided to use the white sand, and because of the red clay, it's very difficult to keep it as natural. So the sand beach was final decision was made to do that. We had some erosion problems with the sand. It's always a maintenance problem. The first, I think it was approximately 10 inches of sand over some sandstone base, and that eroded initially and had to be reestablished. But that's just part of the process of establishing a beach. Again, I'm not familiar with how much sand they have to add, but with the water and the lake action, then it does erode the beach, and you have to maintain it and add sand to it occasionally. So.
What about the other elements of the park? What did you sort of envision first, and then kind of what came later, maybe as you heard it on more people?
Well, I think again we had a very preliminary plan. We did like the circular roadway around the ball fields, and so we definitely were able to maintain that. And then the areas on the northwest side of the lake, we wanted a more natural, informal flow of traffic. The one thing I do remember, in design of the boat docks and the pier. This lake is designed to fluctuate in elevation, I believe about 8 to 10 feet. I've forgotten the exact flood stage. So those were some design difficulties that we had to take into consideration. As far as I know, that we were successful in accomplishing that, although the pier appears to be, the walk pier appears to be high above the water. It was required because of the change in elevation. The floating boat docks had to be designed so that they could rise up to the flood level, max flood level. Excuse me. We were fortunate on the design of the boat ramps that the terrain was very gradual and natural, so that was easy to design. Amphitheater was located in a natural area that lent itself well for the amphitheater. The campgrounds were very easy to design because we had a nice terrain, good gentle slope for the area, and was just actually it was a very easy project to work with. So, maybe I shouldn't say that, but they might want to return the fee, but design fee. No, compared to some sites that we have worked with, it was I think an excellent selection of site by the county and the federal agencies. And of course, as I stated earlier, one of the goals was to control the flood that was very dangerous to Clark County. There had been a number of deaths from flood in the county, downtown area, prior to the, not downtown, but the lower area near downtown area. That I remember, I think there were 2 deaths or 3 just prior to the establishment of this town. Excuse me. I consider it a very unique opportunity and a pleasure to work with a site. Some you look at them and you say, do I really want to tackle this project? But this was one that was, I considered very easy to work with.
Was there any part of the project, maybe, I don't know, a building or a picnic area or something that was sort of last minute or an afterthought that you all of a sudden thought, oh, we really need this?
Not that I can remember, except maybe the building that we're occupying, the Visitor Center. That was not on the original master plan. We probably did not anticipate the need for that, for this facility, until the park was open and being utilized. The initial, I think, design was such that the office for personnel would be in the government offices, and this would be opened in the mornings, and they would come out and then be closed in the early afternoon or early evening. So I think this building would be the only one I can think of that was not initially envisioned. Let me back up. I think there was a vision for this type of facility, but could not convince the agencies that to justify it, and until the park was open, and it immediately became obvious that needed just a little bit more a local facility for office and visitation and orientation projects.
How involved were you after the park actually opened?
I'm trying to remember. I think probably for at least we did this project in phases, so we were probably involved after it opened for 3-4 years. I just don't remember the exact time period. But I do know that once the park was open, all of the facilities were not in, and we were fortunate enough to be allowed to continue with the design phase of those projects. We did do this building as part of a later contract. And then as far as daily operation, that was county responsibility.
Yeah, that wouldn't be something you'd have to deal with, I would imagine.
Yeah.
Let's see. I'm trying to think what else I was I've got a bunch of other things that I was
Sure.
going to kind of ask, but I'm trying to remember what I've already asked. Do you remember any kind of parts of the park being added later, other than, now you mentioned the visitor center? I know some land was actually added. And were you involved in that at all, or?
I can't remember. I don't think I was. If there was additional properties other than what I showed you on the original boundary,
Okay.
Except for the from the dam south as part of the nature trail, I was involved in some of the acquisition of the properties. As I stated earlier, in working with the developers and property owners, some of which have never developed their property, but were willing to either donate or trade for tax incentives.
And that's Cook's Trail?
Yes, that's Cook's Trail.
Was that a part of the original design?
No, it was not. That was something that came later, and I think that was probably Nancy and Walter Cook's desire. I do remember one instant where I walked that before it was established with Nancy and Walter, and I remember walking in waist-deep water and swamp, and actually very concerned that snakes would bite me, but Nancy and Walter assured me they would not, so I still hold that against them, but no, it was very interesting. Actually, we walked the trail, and we got to a point in that we were so deep into the swamp we couldn't. It was not beneficial to turn around, so we just went on through, and it was quite an experience that day. I don't know whether Nancy or Walter remember it, but I do very, very vividly. But did walk the initial trail with them, and did some volunteer work as far as design at the Nature Center, but most of the work was under contract with the county that we did. And we did design some of the facilities at Sandy Creek Park in the early stages of the park.
Yeah.
But I haven't worked on this park in the last, I would say, 15 years.
Okay. Do you visit the park?
Yes, more so in the 80s and 90s. 2000 have not visited it very much at all.
Your kids are grown up, I assume.
Yes, they're grown now and have children of their own. And as I get closer to retirement, we have some property in the North Carolina mountains, and so most of our time is spent there.
How did the park today, or the park even 15 years ago or 10 years ago when you visited more often, how did it compare to your original sort of vision for the park? You know, when you first came and looked around and thought, okay, this is what this will be.
I guess I would have liked to have seen over the years a little more care and maintenance of the park, and a little bit more advancing the park. And by that I mean just refining the areas that we established. And I was a little disappointed during the 90s that I think the park might have been neglected. I think funds flowed to other areas in the county, and probably that just had to be, but that was a little disappointing to me that I felt like Sandy Creek Park was neglected. But I don't know the inner workings of the county organization at that time and the thought process and what the citizens were, demanding. And you have to, many times when it's a public facility, you have to go where the citizens request you go. So I just don't know. But that was a little disappointing to me that I felt like it just wasn't maturing as elegantly as it could. And would like to have seen just refinement.
When you say refinement, I guess, what do you mean by that?
Well, what little that I have observed is that the visual manicure of the facility, the buildings, have not been maintained quite as well. However, as we said in this room, for the use of 20 years, it looks good, but I still think that very little has been done to update and enhance the park. Signage, things of that nature, and it just a little more care. Personal care maybe hasn't been involved. And hopefully you just expressed as a new manager, maybe he will have that opportunity. And like I said, I don't know the inner workings in the past 10 years. So I don't think that the formal ball fields, I don't think this park was designed to be a very formal, high-use facility. I think the ball fields were designed for families and groups to be able to just come out and play informal ball. The county does have facilities that are more, how should I say, intense, designed for intense use. I don't think this project was envisioned to be high intensity use, but I don't know what the daily use is now, but I think probably could be a little higher. I'm not sure how many citizens, newer citizens to the county, are really aware of the facilities at Sandy Creek Park and at Sandy Creek Nature Center are available to them.
Yeah.
Of course, I do know from being familiar with some of the services offered by Clark County, there are a lot of services in the leisure service department that are offered. So maybe this is just one that is being utilized more than I realize at this time.
I guess if you had the opportunity to kind of come back and, as you've seen the park develop, change something about the design, what would it be, or would there be anything?
Today, I don't know of anything. Of course, I haven't, in 2005, been through the park and looked at it, but I can't think of anything at the present time.
It was well done, I guess.
Well, no, I wouldn't say that. I would be interested to hear the comments of the managers and what they have to work with and what they would like to see changed or revised. But I do think we were fortunate at the time that the park was designed that we had some flexibility and were able to hopefully work out some of the major problems that you would have. And with this larger site, and no more organized activities than we proposed for the site, it was easy to work with.
Yeah. What's your favorite part of the park?
I guess there were two areas that were my favorite part. The trail on the west side of the park, I remember, from the amphitheater around to the pier and back into the wooded area there and around to the community building. Some of those trails I personally enjoyed. Also enjoyed the east side where the camp facilities were. I always liked to walk in that area. Did not ever camp here. My sons did camp here quite a bit, fish and utilize the lake, and they liked the camp areas. Of course, they were younger and they wanted to know why they couldn't drive their car down or pickup truck down the trail, but I think they realized, after they utilized the facility, why it was done that way. I would say the trail around the lake was my favorite part.
So the more natural areas.
Yes.
What have you been doing since designing Sandy Creek Park? You mentioned, of course, you have your own firm.
When we finished Sandy Creek Park, of course, this always, when you do a project of this nature, it opens doors to other projects. But we just continued to do design projects, and then evolved from clients wanting us to stay with the project from design phase all the way through. We became general contractor, and pretty much for the last 15 years, that's what we have done. We now, at the present time, we're working on a large church addition, which we designed and constructed, and we're working on a branch bank, which was designed by a local architect and engineering firm, and we are negotiating on 2 exciting projects for the future. So, principally design and build projects, ranging everything from daycare centers to parks to commercial strip shops, commercial developments.
And those projects now, are you doing the buildings or the landscape?
We do the entire facility.
Okay.
Our firm is more of a design and build. We sit down with the client, find out their needs, outline our services and what we're able to provide, and normally we carry that project to complete finish, where the client occupies the facility, and that would include all the site work, landscaping, the complete project.
Wow.
It's very interesting work.
That was something that I meant to ask. Is coming in as a landscape architect and doing the buildings here. Had you done buildings before, or was it?
Well, we actually hired an architect to work with us on this project. Fortunately, he allowed us to give him a design concept, and then he implemented our concept drawings. So, and it was a very close venture. Wood Campbell was the architect we selected to work with us. He's since passed away a couple of years ago, but would allow us to give him some design ideas, and then he would improve on those and do the finished architectural drawings. So we did not, although we were responsible for the entire project, we did utilize architects and engineers. Ben McElroy and Associates did our field staking and field work.
Looking back on this park, now you mentioned what areas that you like to visit the best. What areas are you proudest of?
I'm sorry?
What areas are you most proud of from a design standpoint?
I think it would just be the park itself. Yes, I think it was a project in our time and in our life and in our business that was it was a large project. It was a unique project because of the joint venture of the county and the federal government and the different entities that we had to satisfy. I'm not sure that at my stage of life that I would want to design this size project. I can't remember the exact time, but I think there was approximately 9 months of working time involved in it, drawing document presentation. I want to remember there was approximately 100 pages of documents and, of course, large specification booklets. And I think our staff was approximately myself and 2 people. So this was quite time consuming for us. I was very fortunate to have a good assistant, Michael Schaffer, and he, I think, did an excellent job helping me carry the project through. I guess in any firm's life, you have certain projects that you're very excited about and enjoy working on, and some that you just do because you have to make a living.
Yeah.
Sandy Creek Park was not one that we did because we had to make a living. It was one we were excited about from initial concept to, or contract time to finished product. And that's just one of the projects that come along in a lifetime that you thoroughly enjoy working with and working on. And as I said earlier, we were fortunate to have good commissioners who they took a personal interest, but they did not want to dictate to you what took place as far as design and concept. They wanted to give you their input, but you were to take it and utilize it the best you could.
Yeah.
So we were very fortunate.
Well, I guess that's about it for actual questions that I have. Do you have anything to add?
No, I've enjoyed the interview, and you've been a lot easier than some people I've had to interview me. So.
Well, I hope so.
Thank you.
The idea is not to put you on the spot. So. Okay. Well, thanks very much.
You're welcome.